do you feel like the character overall this time has really lived up to your expectations?
I thought he was going to be a sidekick in one book, and then
I
I could
love
go
that.
back to working. I could go back to working at my job as a financial analyst for a service department in a high tech company. It was a great job, and I had a blast. And I stayed there for about. I got the contract in July of '87. I quit my job in June of 1990 because the Halflings Gem had come out and did really, really well, hit the New York Times and everything. And so they asked me for 3 more books to tell where Drizzt had come from, and said maybe it's time you quit your day job. And I was scared to death. But are you kidding? First of all, this series has ended probably 5 times since I started. First book, second book. After the third book, they made me tie up the retaking of Mithril Hall in the end of Halfling's Gem because they said people were tired of these characters. We were going to go on to something else, and maybe I could get a deal for some different characters. And then they got a bunch of letters saying, where did Drizzt come from? So they decided to do a trilogy. And then it ended again after Passage to Dawn because I had this really bad breakup with TSR. It was not pretty. And I was like done. And that's when I went and did my DemonWars books. And then when Wizards of the Coast bought TSR out of bankruptcy, they asked me back. And so it got going again. But I thought we were done again after the Hero, the Homecoming series, because I was expecting to go in and sign for more books. And when I went to visit them I was a consultant at the time and I would go in once a year for summits. And I was ready to, my wife and I were planning to buy our retirement home, basically, a beach house. And I went in there ready to sign this big deal. I was going to sign for 10 books and just get it over with, and that would be the last contract I ever signed or whatever. And that's when they told me they weren't doing books anymore. So I thought that was the end of it then. It just so many times I expected it to be over and thought it was over 3 different times.
Yeah.
And I never expected any of this. Are you kidding? I just wanted to write a book. I wrote my first book longhand in a spiral notebook by candlelight to Fleetwood Mac's Tusk album in 1982. And I wrote it. I didn't even know how to type. I wasn't thinking of getting published. I only wrote the book so that I would have something to give to my kids if I ever had kids, who would give to my grandkids if I ever had grandkids, so they would know a little bit more about me. I didn't want to just be a number. I wanted to accomplish something. So I'm going to write a book. And mostly it was because I had fallen in love with fantasy in college with Tolkien. 1978, early 78, I read the Tolkien books. And by the time I sat down and wrote my first book, which was called Echoes of the Fourth Magic, which is still out there, by the way, I had run out of books to read in the genre I loved. I had read all of the Brooks, Shannara books. I had read the Stephen Donaldson, Lord Fowl's Bane books. I had read Elric. I had read Fritz Leiber was out there. I had read the Master of Five Magics, some of the Ian McCaffrey books, but I pretty much read every fantasy book I could find. And again, this is way before the internet. So I know there were a bunch of others, but if my local stores didn't have them, I had no way of even knowing about them. So I was basically out of books to read. So I sat down and I wrote a book. I was a job that required absolutely no brain power. I would stand on this little metal bench 10 hours a day next to this big metal table, and I would load lumps of scrap plastic into a grinder. And the most intellectual part of the job was remembering every 20 minutes I had to change the barrel, or I'd get flakes of plastic all over the floor because the barrel would be full. And that was my job. And the other duties in the plastics factory, all of which were equally boring. But I had to pay for college. This is how I was paying for college. That and bouncing in nightclubs, which was a whole different kind of fun. So I wrote a book in my head, and then I sat down and I wrote it because I wanted to. And then I sent it out, got some rejection letters, put it on the shelf, got married. The kids were coming along. Finally wound up working in high tech, using my degree a little bit. But I wound up in finance, which had nothing to do. I went to school for communications media, and I wound up working in finance. But I was always great in math, so I didn't have a problem with that. And I was doing really well. I was getting promoted, and this was my career. But I kept working. When the kids were in bed, I'd do a little writing. And when I sent the book out and I actually got a bite on it, I was like, wow, I'm finally going to see my name on a bookshelf. And that's all I cared about. I would have one book out there and that would be enough. So I thought. And it just kept going from there. I never planned this. I never expected to be a writer. When I was a kid, I wanted to be either an archaeologist or an astronaut. And then as I went through school, I figured I'd be a technical writer. I never realized I'd become a professional liar, which is kind of
making up stories.
Yeah, I write fiction. I'm a professional liar. But I had no idea. I mean, I knew Drizzt became special to me because when I started writing that book, I thought it was Wolfgar's book. And the first scene I was sitting down to write was Drizzt running across the tundra when he got jumped by Yetis and rescued by the dwarf. It's like on page 2, I knew it was his book. It wasn't Wolfgar's. It completely caught me by surprise. So no, expectations. Are you kidding? If you had told me that I would meet Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and the original D&D team, and I would have never believed you.